All right, welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we're going deep on Carl Jung,
Yes.
and specifically one of his most well-known ideas,
Right.
his concept of archetypes.
Uh-huh.
And I think a lot of our listeners are probably familiar with this in some way, shape, or form,
Yeah, for sure.
whether they realize it or not.
Absolutely.
I mean, it pops up everywhere, right?
Yeah.
You see it in art, in literature, in mythology.
Yeah, you see it in religions all over the world.
Yeah, all over the place.
Yeah.
And so I'm really excited to kind of get into this
And too.
and to share these ideas with our listeners, because I really do think that understanding these ideas can really help us better understand ourselves
For sure.
and the world around us.
100%.
So in this deep dive, we're going to be looking at excerpts from a YouTube video transcript
Okay.
titled Jung y el ocultismo, Arquetipos, Sombra y Proceso de Individuación.
Yeah.
And that's from the Revelando, Velo, en Español channel. And so we're going to kind of dive into Jung's core ideas about archetypes.
Right.
Where they come from, what they mean, and why they're so important.
Absolutely.
So let's just get right into it.
Yeah, let's do it.
What are archetypes?
Okay, well, basically, Jung observed all these recurring patterns and models across various fields.
Okay.
He noticed these patterns in art, in literature, in mythology, in religion, in philosophy.
Okay.
And he called these patterns archetypes.
Okay.
And you can kind of think of them as universal representations of different people or events or figures that share the same underlying ideas or concepts.
So you're saying it's like, like the same type of character might pop up in different stories.
Yeah, exactly.
Different cultures, different religions, but it's the same.
It's like the same kind of fundamental. Like you might see the wise old man archetype.
Right.
Or you might see the hero archetype.
Okay.
And these archetypes appear
again and again and again.
Okay.
And Jung believed that these weren't just coincidences.
Yeah.
He didn't think that people were just coming up with these same ideas independently.
Yeah.
He saw these archetypes as primordial forms of knowledge that are innate to humans.
So this is like idea that we're born with some kind of knowledge.
Yeah, like an inherited knowledge.
That's passed down from our ancestors.
Exactly. Like we are predisposed to think in a certain way based on these archetypes.
And that's obviously a pretty controversial idea.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, that's not something that's easily...
It's not something you can just test in a lab.
Right.
But it's an idea that has had a huge impact on a lot of different fields.
Okay, so the transcript mentions that his work wasn't always well received.
Yeah, I mean, some people found it too mystical or too speculative.
Yeah.
And it didn't always fit neatly into the scientific worldview of the time. So how was it that Jung was approaching these ideas? Like, what was his method?
Well, Jung had this really interesting interdisciplinary approach.
Okay.
He was connecting science and psychology with religion and philosophy, and even with esoteric doctrines like alchemy, astrology, the tarot.
Wow. So he was really looking at all these different areas.
Yeah, he was really trying to bring all these different things together.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And the transcript even mentions that he had a significant influence on Western occultism.
Right.
Which I think a lot of people might not realize.
Yeah, his ideas about the unconscious and about archetypes have really resonated with people who are interested in esotericism.
So can you give me like a concrete example?
Yeah, sure.
Of how Jung's ideas kind of shifted the way people were looking at these more esoteric traditions?
So a good example is Western astrology.
Okay.
So historically, astrology was often used to try to predict external events in people's lives.
Right, like whether you were going to...
Yeah, like if you're going to get married or if you're going to get a promotion.
Have a good year or bad day.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Jung's psychological perspective really shifted that focus.
Okay.
Instead of looking outward at these external events, he started looking inward at the individual psyche.
Interesting.
So it became less about predicting the future and more about understanding yourself.
Wow. So it sounds like he really brought psychology into the mystical and a sense of mystery into psychology.
Exactly.
I love that.
And it's interesting because Jung himself actually acknowledged that esoteric astrology and the tarot were key influences on his own thinking about archetypes.
Wow.
Which is pretty wild.
That's pretty cool for a psychologist to admit.
Yeah. It really shows you how open he was to exploring these different ideas.
I mean, it definitely makes me curious to kind of dig into his background a little bit.
Yeah.
And see where all this came from.
Well, his family background's really fascinating. It's definitely worth exploring.
The transcript mentions his grandfather, also named Carl Gustav Jung.
Right.
And he was a high-ranking Freemason.
He was the Grand Master of the Swiss Freemasons.
Wow.
Which is a pretty big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were even rumors that he was related to Goethe.
Right.
The famous German writer.
Yeah, and it turns out those rumors were probably true.
Really?
Yeah. Family members have said that Jung's grandfather was Goethe's illegitimate son.
Oh, wow.
And Jung himself actually hinted at this in 2 of his books.
That's amazing.
So it's very likely that Jung was Goethe's great-grandson.
So he's got this incredible intellectual and cultural lineage.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it wasn't just family history, was it?
No, not at all.
The transcript mentions his involvement with theosophists.
Right.
And esoteric circles, even attending seances in the early 20th century.
Yeah, he was really interested in these occult and spiritual ideas.
So he wasn't just reading about them, he was experiencing them firsthand.
Yeah, he was really immersed in this world.
That's pretty incredible. And so what was he trying to do with all this? Like, what was his goal in connecting these ideas?
I think he was trying to find a way to harmonize these spiritual and esoteric concepts with psychology.
So kind of bridge the gap between the mystical and the psychological.
Exactly. He was really interested in how these 2 realms could inform each other.
And that brings us back to the archetypes, right?
Yeah.
Because the transcript points out that Jung's archetypes are largely analogous to symbolism found in various esoteric traditions.
Exactly. Like if you look at the symbolism in alchemy or in the tarot, you see a lot of the same patterns and figures that you see in Jung's archetypes.
So give me an example. What kind of symbolic figures or characters are we talking about?
Okay, so think about characters like the father, the mother, the devil, the youth, the hero, the saint, the old man.
Right. And those are all figures that we see in myths and legends and religions all over the world.
And then there are archetypal events.
Okay.
Like birth, the journey, initiation, death.
Okay, yeah.
These are universal human experiences that are often represented symbolically.
Okay.
And Jung believed that these archetypal symbols are the language of the collective unconscious.
Okay, so help me understand that a little bit.
Yeah.
What do you mean by the language of the collective unconscious?
So the collective unconscious is this idea that there's a part of our minds that we all share.
Okay.
It's not just our individual experiences and memories, but it's also the experiences and memories of all of humanity.
And so these symbols are a way for us to tap into that.
Exactly.
Okay.
They're a way for us to understand these universal human experiences.
And so because these patterns of interpretation are universal,
that means they're not limited to one specific culture or time period.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You see these archetypes in cultures all over the world throughout history.
Okay.
And I think that's what makes them so powerful because they speak to something fundamental about the human experience.
So the stories that we tell, the myths that we create, they're all drawing from this same...
They're all drawing from this same well.
Yeah.
The same collective unconscious.
Okay.
And I think that's what makes them so resonant.
Yeah.
Because they tap into something deep within us.
So we have these universal symbols, we have these archetypes, but how do they actually manifest themselves in the real world?
Well, they can take a lot of different forms.
Okay.
So for example, the hero archetype can manifest as a knight in shining armor in one culture and as a brave warrior in another culture.
Okay.
The outer form is different, but the underlying archetype is the same. It's the same idea of bravery, of overcoming obstacles, of fighting for what's right.
Exactly. And Jung actually defined a primordial image or archetype as this, a figure that repeats itself in the course of history wherever creative fantasy is freely manifested.
Okay.
Basically, it's a mythological figure that contains a piece of human psychology and destiny.
So it's like this figure that keeps popping up in different forms, but always carrying with it this essential piece of the human experience.
Exactly.
Okay. So what role do these archetypes play in our own individual psyches?
Well, Jung believed that archetypes represent these universal patterns and images within our collective unconscious. Okay. And he saw them as being inherited, much like our instincts. Yeah. So they're not something we learn through our personal experiences. Right. They're something we're born with. Okay. They're a fundamental part of our psychological makeup.
But if they're in our unconscious, how do we become aware of them? How do they actually influence us?
Well, Jung believed that even though archetypes are unconscious, we can still become aware of them through certain activities.
Like what?
Like through dream analysis, through active imagination, through working with symbols. Okay. And he believed that by becoming aware of these archetypes, we could gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and our own behavior.
So what was his goal in all this?
Well, I think his ultimate goal was to help people become more whole. Okay. He believed that by understanding our dominant archetypes and how they influence us, we could build better relationships, understand our needs better, develop greater self-awareness, and ultimately become better versions of ourselves.
Okay. So it's really about self-improvement.
Yeah, I think that was a big part of it. Yeah. But it was also about something bigger than that. Okay. It was about understanding the human condition and our place in the cosmos.
And the transcript actually draws an interesting parallel between this process of understanding archetypes and the alchemical process of transformation.
Yeah, it's like we're trying to turn lead into gold. Yeah. We're trying to take our raw, unconscious material and transform it into something more refined.
Okay, that's really interesting. So how did Jung's ideas differ from Freud's?
Well, Jung initially started out as a follower of Freud. Okay. But they eventually had a falling out. Yeah. And Jung went on to develop his own school of thought, analytical psychology. Okay. And one of the main differences between their ideas was their understanding of the unconscious mind. Okay. So Freud focused mainly on the personal unconscious, which is basically all of our repressed memories and desires. Okay. But Jung believed that there was a deeper layer to the unconscious that he called the collective unconscious.
And this is what he saw as being the source of archetypes.
Exactly. Yeah. He believed that the collective unconscious is shared by all of humanity. Okay. And that it contains all of the primordial images and patterns of behavior that have been passed down through generations.
And so for Freud, it was really all about the individual and their own personal experiences.
Exactly.
And Jung was looking at something much broader.
Yeah, he was looking at the human experience as a whole. Okay. And he believed that the collective unconscious was just as important as the personal unconscious in understanding who we are.
So it's like he was expanding on Freud's ideas.
Yeah, he was taking Freud's ideas and kind of pushing them further. Yeah. He was saying that there's more to the unconscious mind than just our own personal repressed memories. Yeah. He was saying that there's this whole other realm of the unconscious that we all share.
And that's where the archetypes come from.
Exactly.
Okay, so how did this idea of the collective unconscious change the way that we understand ourselves?
Well, for one thing, it means that we're not just blank slates at birth. Okay. We're not just products of our environment. Yeah. We also inherit these unconscious patterns of behavior from our ancestors.
And these patterns can influence our thoughts, our feelings, our actions.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're not just individuals. Right. We're also part of this larger collective.
Exactly. And I think that's a really powerful idea because it means that we're all connected in a way that we might not even realize.
So we talked about how Jung initially identified 4 main archetypes. Right. Can you go through those in a little more detail?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first one is the persona.
Okay.
And the persona is basically the mask that we wear in public. Okay. It's the way that we present ourselves to the world. Okay. And it's important to have a persona because it helps us to function in society. But the danger is that we can become too identified with our persona. And we can lose touch with our true selves.
So it's like we're playing a role rather than being authentic.
Exactly. And Jung believed that if we become too identified with our persona, it can lead to all sorts of psychological problems because we're not being true to ourselves.
So the persona is like the face that we show to the world. Yeah. Okay. What about the shadow?
The shadow is the part of ourselves that we repress. Okay. It's all of the things that we don't want to admit about ourselves.
Like our negative qualities.
Yeah, like our anger, our rage, our jealousy, our selfishness, our laziness. Okay. All of the things that we try to hide from the world and from ourselves. Okay. And Jung believed that the shadow is just as important as the persona. Okay. because it's a part of who we are.
Yeah.
And if we try to deny it, it's going to come out in unhealthy ways.
So it's like this dark side of ourselves that we need to acknowledge and integrate into our personality.
Exactly.
Okay. What about the anima and the animus?
So the anima is the feminine archetype in men.
Okay.
And the animus is the masculine archetype in women.
Okay.
And Jung believed that these archetypes are responsible for a lot of the attraction that we feel for the opposite sex.
Okay.
Because we're projecting our own anima or animus onto the other person.
So it's like we're looking for the missing piece of ourselves.
Yeah, exactly.
In the other person.
Exactly.
Okay. And finally, what about the self?
The self is the archetype of wholeness. It's the integration of all of the other archetypes into a unified whole.
Okay.
And Jung believed that the goal of life is to achieve individuation.
Yeah.
Which is the process of becoming a fully realized self.
So it's about becoming who we were meant to be.
Exactly.
Okay. That's a really powerful idea.
Yeah, it is. And it's something that we can all strive for.
And the transcript points out that Jung's ideas had a big impact on how we interpret esoteric doctrines like the tarot.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So how did he change our understanding of the tarot?
Well, before Jung, the tarot was often seen as just a fortune-telling tool.
Okay.
But Jung saw the tarot as a symbolic representation of the human psyche.
Okay.
He saw the different cards as representing different archetypes and different stages of the individuation process.
So each card is like a little window into our unconscious.
Exactly.
Okay, that's really cool.
Yeah, it is. And it really opens up a whole new way of looking at the tarot.
So we've talked about how Jung's ideas were really influential.
Yeah.
But the transcript also notes that they weren't as popular in the scientific field as Freud's were.
Right.
So why do you think that was?
I think it's because Jung's ideas were a little bit too mystical for the scientific community.
Okay.
I mean, he was talking about things like the collective unconscious and archetypes.
Yeah.
And these are concepts that are hard to measure or quantify.
Right.
So I think that's why his ideas were never really fully embraced by mainstream psychology.
Okay, so his work has been more influential in other fields.
Yeah, like in literature and art and mythology.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's because his ideas really resonate with people who are interested in the deeper meaning of things.
Yeah.
People who are looking for a way to understand the human experience in a more holistic way.
So even though his work wasn't always accepted by the scientific community, it still had a profound impact on the way that we think about ourselves.
Absolutely.
And the world.
His work has really changed the way that we see the world.
Yeah.
And I think that's a testament to the power of his ideas.
Well, I think this has been a really fascinating exploration of Jung's archetypes.
Yeah, me too.
I've learned a lot.
It's always great to talk about Jung.
Yeah.
He was such a brilliant and insightful thinker.
Absolutely. And I think his ideas are more relevant today than ever.
I agree.
Especially in a world that's so fragmented and disconnected.
Yeah, his ideas about the collective unconscious and about the importance of individuation, I think those are really important ideas for us to be thinking about right now.
Well, on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I encourage all of our listeners to consider how these archetypal patterns might be showing up in their own lives and in the world around them.
And how might understanding your own dominant archetype help you to live a more fulfilling and authentic life?
That's a great question.
It's something to think about.
Yeah, definitely. So we'd love to hear your thoughts and any further questions you have.
Yeah, leave a comment below.
Yeah, leave a comment below, and until our next deep dive, keep exploring.
Keep diving.